Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We spoke with Daryl Press, who is an associate professor of government at Dartmouth College and whose work has focused broadly on U.S. national security policy, focusing on the changing global balance of power that we see today, but also with an emphasis on the evolution of technology and warfare, as well as the future of deterrence. Daryl, we're super excited to have you on the podcast here today. As we've done with a number of these now, we've covered all 9 nuclear weapon states at this point, I think, on the podcast. We've discussed complexity, systems engineering, really have covered the waterfront. I have asked everyone as we've gone through this to kind of kick off by giving us a rundown of what they lay out in their piece. But I wanted to note right up front that your paper really captures the attention off the bat in terms of how strategic instability, as you put it, may be returning in a particularly dangerous form. And the details that you lay out in the paper really kind of begin to freak me out a little bit as someone who's spent a lot of time with this over the course of years. That's saying something, I think. So maybe what we could do is we could kick off by asking you to kind of lay out the argument that you make in the piece and kind of the underlying evidence for what you're arguing.
Thank you. So the piece starts with a little bit of old news, namely, for decades, analysts of nuclear deterrence have understood that if nuclear armed countries feel that their arsenals are vulnerable to destruction, they're liable to take steps to protect them, but steps which have the consequence of making us all worse off.
Yeah.
For example, if they feel their arsenals are vulnerable to destruction, they might substantially increase the size of their arsenals. They might increase the alert levels, raising the risk of accidents. They might decentralize launch authority. All of this to avert this condition which people refer to as strategic instability, the fear that one will be decapitated or have one's arsenal destroyed in an attack. So the piece starts with that old story about nuclear weapons and deterrence, but then it makes the observation that there are a set of changes, some of which are underway, some of which have already happened, which seem to substantially increase the vulnerability of arsenals around the world. And many of them revolve around changing conditions related to NC3. So the implication being these changes are increasing strategic instability and raising the risks that countries will feel compelled to take these dangerous steps to protect their deterrent arsenals.
Yeah, and it's something that, we've had a number of conversations recently that have brought this to the fore, not just in an academic sense, right? That this is something that when talking to Feroz, for example, in the Pakistan context, or going through this with Elsa in the China context, this is happening, and this is driving the decision making as to how people are going to really posture themselves going forward. Can you start to dive a little bit into the details of what you're seeing, and you lay this out on the paper, so kind of to an extent for those who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet. Yeah, what are some of those pieces that you see that are developing that could actually lend towards that shift in how folks see their own safety and security?
Absolutely. And just to build on something you said a moment ago, in my mind, this is so far away from the world of theoretical abstraction.
Yeah.
This is describing trends that are going on the ground right now, whether we're talking about the deterrence balance on the Korean Peninsula, or we're talking about the India-Pakistan balance, or even as we're talking about possible changes in the NATO-Russian relationship. So I think it's very far away from theoretical abstraction.
Yeah.
To get into the details, you said, well, what are the changes that are potentially raising risks of strategic instability? I think there's at least three classes. One of them, the first class has to do with changes in technology. The second class has to do with changes in the style of conventional war that is waged by countries like the United States.
Yeah.
And the third thing is the greater requirements or the more demanding requirements that countries are asking of their nuclear arsenals. Changes in each of these three dimensions, which we can talk about, are all placing greater strains on NC3, nuclear command and control, and in the process, making countries more concerned about the survivability of their nuclear arsenals.
And hey, Daryl, can I actually? This is something that comes up routinely in conversation with a variety of different types of folks, but primarily with younger students and younger folks who have an interest in these issues. They don't quite understand survivability. And this is something that you've written about fairly extensively over time. Those components of survivability that are kind of the assumptions that underpin survivability are what are at risk. Would you mind just taking a second to lay that out? What are those assumptions that lend towards a reliability or the fact that you can actually think that your weapons are going to be survivable? Would you mind walking through that a little bit just for folks who aren't as familiar?
Absolutely. So the first thing to say is the whole nuclear deterrence mission is kind of sitting on a foundation of force survivability, meaning at its essence, the idea of nuclear deterrence is I tell you not to do certain things, or else I will respond with some nuclear attack of some sort.
Yep.
But that's premised on the idea that I will have nuclear weapons
Right.
after you've done those things to me. So if my force is not survivable and can't absorb an attack from you and subsequently respond, then not only might I not have a reliable nuclear deterrent, I might have a very tempting preemptive target that might even invite an attack from you. And so the idea of force survivability, that my force can withstand an attack from you and still respond, is at the absolute foundation of nuclear deterrence. So, how have countries tried to build force survivability? There are basically three strategies they've employed, and most nuclear armed countries have used some combination of them. Number one is hardening, meaning emplacing their nuclear weapons in locations that make them difficult to attack, in, let's say, hardened underground missile silos or something like that. Number two is concealment or mobility, meaning making it hard to locate or track one's nuclear forces. And then the third one is redundancy. And you saw a great deal of redundancy in the Cold War in terms of these arsenals that at that time, reached up into the tens of thousands of nuclear weapons.
Right.
So those are the three strategies that countries have adopted to make their forces survivable. And unfortunately, changes in technology are eroding at least two of the planks of those strategies.
Hmm.
I mean, when we talk about changes of technology affecting the survivability of nuclear weapons and hence crisis stability, in my mind, there's at least two families of technologies that are having primary effects here. One of them is the accuracy revolution, which, in the last 25 years, or actually the last 35 years, countries have developed the ability to deliver munitions, whether conventional munitions or nuclear munitions, essentially with pinpoint accuracy.
Yeah.
And the result is that hardening as a strategy has been essentially negated. The idea that you're going to protect your nuclear forces by putting them in a hard target, it worked 25 years ago. Now it's more or less fruitless. The second major technological change is all the technologies that are wrapped up in the remote sensing revolution.
Yeah.
The ability to observe and locate things on the surface of the earth from drones, from satellites, from acoustic sensors, from a variety of different sensing platforms. And what those are doing is they are making it more and more difficult to hide one's nuclear forces or one's command and control facilities by simply concealing them or moving them around. The one caveat I'd point out real quickly is to say, in my view, and based on some research that I've done with Keir Lieber, the accuracy revolution has already negated hardening as a realistic strategy for force survivability. I would not say the remote sensing revolution has negated concealment and mobility. What they've done is they've made it a lot harder for those who wish to hide nuclear forces than ever in the past.
And it's only going to get more complicated and harder from here, right?
Absolutely. It's a constant competition between the hiders and the seekers. The
Yep.
hiders are trying to hide submarines, hide mobile missiles, hide mobile command posts, and the seekers are trying to find them. It's always going to be a back and forth competition, but technology is changing in directions that are making it a lot harder for the hiders and a lot easier for the seekers.
As you note in the paper, so we started to talk about the tech a little bit. You also noted the strain that these changes start to put on NC3, because we try to come back to that as part of this podcast. Because really, we could spend the whole day talking about the accuracy revolution in and of itself, in my opinion. And we can come back to that. But in terms of the strain that starts to put on NC3, I think one of the things that you note is really is it's come out in many of our conversations and is part of this larger project that this is not something that's prioritized in terms of resource allocation and importance, even in the United States. Um, that starts to become even more complicated when you think about a country like Pakistan or elsewhere where they just don't have the resources. So, as you've thought about the changes that technology is imbuing into these systems, just kind of walk us through your thoughts on how that begins to impact how these other states are going to have to deal with the problem.
So let me be frank. I'm not an
Yeah,
expert on the kind of the acquisition process or the defense
sure,
politics
sure.
in Pakistan or North Korea or even in the United States. In the U.S. military, I think it's fair to say that for good and understandable reasons, conventional forces and conventional missions, which are the bread and butter of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, those get priority in terms of force structure, in terms of personnel, in terms of promotions.
Yep.
And the nuclear mission has often felt, since probably the 1960s, that it was a little bit of the stepchild of the other ones. Within the nuclear mission, priority in force structure and funding and assignments typically goes to the nuclear combat forces, to the missiles, to the submarines, to the bombers. And less attention and less resources are invested in the connective tissue that makes the whole thing work, the communication systems. And so, in general, this orphan mission
Yep.
cuts against nuclear command and control in two different ways. Now, that doesn't mean that can't be overcome. And in the United States in particular, I know that there have been significant upgrades to elements of US nuclear command and control in recent years.
Yep.
But without knowing details about Pakistani defense politics and decision making, it would be a very pleasant surprise if I found out that those who were responsible with both the technical and the doctrinal parts of Pakistani NC3, if they had the prestige and the resources given to them within the Pakistani military as the Air Force or the Army. I'd be surprised.
Yeah, and that bears truth in the conversations that we've had to date. To be quite candid, talking to a variety of different people, that seems to be the reality. I think the way that you characterize it in the piece, right, with few resources, bare bones NC3, it's going to increasingly create a gap between those that can and those that can't keep up with these challenges. So on the technology front, can you go into a little bit of a further level of detail for us when you say that the hardening piece has basically gone to the wayside? What are some examples of how that's come to reality? So you note this, and this is where at the limits of my technical understanding, the burst height compensated fuses on USS LBMs. How does that change the game?
In the late 1990s, early aughts, there were a variety of highly accurate nuclear delivery systems deployed in the United States that essentially, and for the first time, nullified or negated the strategy of hardening targets to avoid US nuclear attacks. So, starting as early as, I guess, 20 years ago now, through the creation of the Trident 2 D5 with the W88 warhead, the idea that somebody was going to protect a target from a US nuclear strike by hardening became almost ridiculous. But since then, there have been a set of other major changes. So, one is a brand new fuse that's being deployed on all US ballistic missiles, submarine launched and land based as well, which improves US accuracy even more. Now, you might say, what's the point of that if we can already destroy things? Well, point number one is now weapons in the US arsenal, which previously had too small a yield to be used against a very hardened target,
Yep.
are now appropriate for such targets. And so even since the 1990s, another round of improvements in the accuracy of US delivery systems has had the effect of greatly increasing the number of US weapons that could be used in such missions. But that's not even the biggest implication. The biggest implication, or the other shoe to fall, is when countries start marrying highly accurate delivery, long range delivery, and conventional weapons. And that's the most significant change to come. Because what that will mean is that no longer will it be the case that the only weapons that threat hardened nuclear targets are nuclear weapons. We will then be entering a world in which precise long range conventional forces are also posing major risks to nuclear targets. And once again, that changes everything in terms of deterrence calculations.
Daryl, if I can just dive in here, what you've been saying about the technological sort of accelerated innovation, deployment, and actual use in war, and thus testing of all these innovations, mostly pertains to the United States and its allies. And that accounts for a fraction only of the 9 nuclear weapon states who are actually the adversaries, for the most part, of the United States and its allies. Some of them, China, Pakistan, even to some extent today, China, Russia, also each other's adversaries. But for, I guess, a substantial fraction at least of the nuclear-prone conflicts, it's the United States on one side who has all these capacities, and it's a relatively technologically primitive, small nuclear weapons state without long-range conventional forces or global reach with its intelligence and surveillance and so forth systems. So it's a very one-sided relationship, if you like. And so I wondered if you could just spell out a bit about how this works at the relationship level, at the conflict relationship level, and go back to the concept of stability, and whether in a world that is so proliferated, the phrase strategic stability actually has much meaning if you have 2, 3, 4, 5 nuclear weapon states all staring down each other's barrels in a particular conflict.
I think what Peter said is exactly right, that it's the United States that it's the forefront of all these technologies. No country in the world has remotely the ISR capabilities of the United States, and no country has come close to exploiting the revolutions in navigation and guidance that the United States has. So we are definitely the first movers in this area. And so principally, when we talk about the vulnerability of nuclear arsenals, I would say everybody's arsenal, as a consequence of these changes, is going to become more vulnerable. But the arsenals that are going to become far more vulnerable far more quickly are adversaries of the United States. So as Peter is suggesting, it is an asymmetric dynamic that we're going to see play out. That said, everybody around the world who has ballistic missiles is working on accuracy. Chinese ballistic missiles seem to be getting very accurate. Russia's ballistic missiles have been quite accurate for some time. Even Iran's ballistic missiles appear to be getting quite accurate. And so the problems posed for nuclear force survivability today, as Peter's suggesting, it's principally the problem faced by North Korea, China, and to some extent Russia. But around the corner, it's the problem faced by everybody. It's a problem faced by Israel if Iran gets nuclear weapons. It's a problem faced by every nuclear armed country who faces somebody with ballistic missiles.
Daryl, can I jump in there? It's something that I think that you flag in the paper that's of interest, right? As the United States continues down this path and follows this doctrinal intention of being able to decapitate and take out an adversary's ability to keep us at standoff distances, etc. The adversary has a vote in that, and they're figuring out ways to get out of our NC3 in order to keep us from being able to do that. And you start to talk about that a little bit. I think that and it's really interesting you note this, and it's obviously it's not lost on these states that we're talking about. The NC3 elements are pretty limited in number. And so for us to be in a position where we can actually execute on that doctrine and those intentions, no matter what the exquisite nature of the technology is on our side, right? If you can take out a couple of elements in that broader system of systems, you're in a really bad spot. So I'm curious as to your thoughts as to that dynamic, right? So the U.S. continues to rush off in this direction, but at the same time, those asymmetric tools that others may deploy may very well undermine some of those abilities.
I think it's true, and I think you're highlighting the rather complicated back and forth nature of this complication. There's another point which Peter was making about these asymmetries, which I think needs to be highlighted, which is there's this underlying asymmetry which is driving much of this competition, which is the asymmetry in conventional military power. In most regions of the world where the United States has allies and interests, the United States expects to have overwhelming conventional military superiority if there's a conventional war. And as a result, adversaries of the United States find themselves looking for strategies to stalemate the US and its allies. And that, in many cases, drives them toward nuclear weapons. So that's the asymmetry that causes them to build these thin nuclear arsenals and thin NC3 capabilities, which our conventional capabilities then threaten. Now, one of their potential responses to that is exactly what Philip just raised, which is to attack one of our points of weakness. It's tough to defeat the entirety of our conventional force structure, but there may be vulnerabilities for the United States in terms of our command and control, in terms of our sensing platforms and communication links. And what seemed to the adversary as means of countering our conventional forces may seem to the United States to be major escalations of a conventional war, especially if they're threatening key components of our nuclear arsenal. So there's a dangerous and uncharted back and forth here, where the United States is building capabilities to neutralize adversary conventional forces, to hold at risk their nuclear forces. And those capabilities are driving adversaries to try to look for end runs around our conventional military power, which may lead them directly into attacks on our NC3 infrastructure. Let me try to put a finer point on something which I tried to say before, and it might not have been so clear, which is here's the coming implication of the accuracy revolution. 25 years ago, if a country wanted to destroy a set of hardened silos with an attack, they would have to use a large number of very large yield nuclear weapons. And whether or not they succeeded, they would cause so much damage and so much fallout, they would have killed necessarily millions of people. That was the past. Now, or in the near future, they will be able to conduct such an attack with conventional weapons. And if they succeed, they succeed. And even if they fail, there won't be nuclear blasts, there won't be nuclear detonations, there won't be nuclear fallout. And the consequence is that the costs of launching attacks on hardened targets is dropping dramatically. The human costs, the risks of escalation, as conventional weapons get much more accurate, which raises very profound questions about the deterrence, about the stability of deterrence in coming decades.
Daryl, that's a perfect segue to a question that takes us back to the Cold War and then back to this, it sounds like a rather dismal future, which I'm reminded of in this conversation of Des Ball's famous Delphi paper on the vulnerability of command and control in the nuclear field. I think it was 1981. And in that paper, he famously argued that the NC3 systems of the United States and the former Soviet Union were vulnerable, and that attempts to harden these systems, whilst important, would fail, would be insufficient to remove that critical vulnerability, because you can always accelerate offense against such systems faster than you can successfully defend them. So the offense will always win out in that particular form of the arms race. As a result, NC3 targeting will always dominate. The overall system will always be vulnerable, and in a sense, each of the superpowers were chasing their own tail. And his recommendation was a rather plaintive one right at the end of the second of the those two Adelphi papers, which was basically do your best to get rid of that vulnerability, but then control for the instability by cooperation. And so he then supported a highly controversial overseas American base in Australia, where I come from originally, called Pine Gap, which is still the most important American early warning base in the world, which serves the American military with its eyes and ears on the now Russian and especially the Chinese, but also pretty much everyone in Asia's nuclear forces, tells us when they would be lifting off or firing their missiles at each other or at us. And the final sentence was basically the solution to this problem is to switch to conventional forces for deterrence purposes and warfighting and get rid of nuclear weapons. Now, from what you've said, that's exactly what the United States did at the end of the Cold War. It implemented the revolution on military affairs, in spades. It prosecuted long-range conventional wars around the world. But the irony is that much of what was in place in terms of cooperation, both political and in terms of nuclear arms control, is pretty much evaporated. We're not in a world in which we're cooperating. And so my question is there a solution? Are we doomed to either be at the brink of nuclear war because of this asymmetry and fear of first strike, most of all against the eyes and ears of a nuclear weapons state, or to a conventionally armed to the teeth world in which that's how we deter each other? What's the way out of this vortex?
Your question is, what's the solution to war and peace and the human condition? I'm not sure if I have an answer to that, but I guess what I would say is your description of, I think, the end of the Cold War is right, and about the U.S. directions of weapons investment at that time. But I think there was a fundamental change which has escaped many people's notice, which is during most of the Cold War, the United States and its NATO allies perceived themselves to be conventionally weak. They thought that if there was a big conventional war in Europe, that NATO was going to lose. And therefore, it was NATO and the United States who intended to intentionally escalate a conventional war to the nuclear level. Today, the same dynamic exists, but the shoe is on the other foot. Around the world, the United States and its allies are generally strong at the conventional level. And therefore, it's our adversaries who have an incentive to threaten escalation, brandish weapons in a crisis, and if necessary, employ nuclear weapons in some sort of a limited way to try to create stalemate. We hear such a strategy now and we think that's horrible and cold-blooded. That was NATO's strategy for decades. But now it's the strategy that North Korea must rely upon, and Pakistan must rely upon, and maybe Russia must rely upon, because they're conventionally weak. So the solution to this, I'm not sure, because the things that are driving countries to rely upon nuclear weapons today are largely the things that drove the United States and NATO to rely upon them in the Cold War, which is a belief that they couldn't compete at the conventional level. So to bring it back to your question, Peter, you posed it as, would we be better off with a world in which we were all armed to the teeth with conventional weapons or nuclear weapons? I'll tell you, for the Pakistans of the world and the North Koreas and maybe the Russias, they don't see that as a choice. They simply know they can't compete at the conventional level. Yeah. And therefore they rely on nuclear weapons as a cheaper stalemating alternative for the exact same reason that the United States and NATO did during the Cold War.
Or they have to make their peace in some form or other with their arch enemies.
Well, that's exactly right. So to me, the hope in all these relationships is political, which is finding, rules of the game and a way to live together with the status quo, so that neither side really thinks that there's a high likelihood that they're going to be fighting for their lives. But to be honest, in the real world, there are countries around the world with nuclear weapons who face adversaries who might want to harm them. But here's the core thing regarding this discussion about NC3 and crisis stability and nuclear deterrence. If there's a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula, which could be brought about by a half dozen different causes, almost immediately, North Korea will be losing that war. Almost immediately, the North Korean regime will realize that they have very few options to force the South Koreans and the US to stop. And really, the principal option they have is nuclear escalation. And what North Korea is going to realize almost instantly is that the NC3 that they rely upon is being rapidly attrited by US conventional operations. So whether or not there's a larger political purpose of North Korean nuclear weapons in their foreign policy, what I'm pointing out is the fragile nature of their NC3, and in fact, the fragile nature of their nuclear deterrent creates major escalatory risks were there a serious crisis or a conventional conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
So here's the question: why is their NC3 fragile? I mean, they lay fiber optic cable and they have couriers and they have a few short range radios. That constitutes the technical basis of their NC3, and they have mobile missiles which can be fired before we could strike them.
There's two reasons for the vulnerability here. Number one is the conventional war plans for the United States and South Korea. The conventional plans would put North Korean command and control and leadership at the center of US conventional efforts from the very first moments of war. And so in the very first moments of conventional war on the Korean Peninsula, there would literally be hundreds of bombs raining down on North Korean air defense sites, on North Korean leadership sites, in North Korean alternative command posts, on North Korean communications nodes. And so very quickly in a conventional war, the North Korean leadership would have difficulty communicating amongst themselves and knowing which of them are still alive and which of their nuclear forces had and had not been targeted yet and which they could still communicate with. So that's point number one, is just the nature of US conventional operations will be deeply, deeply threatening to North Korean leadership and ability to control any of their forces, including their nuclear. The flip side of that is that the actual nuclear requirements for North Korea are more complicated than we typically assume. We typically assume as long as they have one or two bombs left, as long as they have the ability to communicate in some fashion with one of them, that's all the capability they need. But if you actually put yourself in their shoes and you ask, how might they use nuclear escalatory threats to try to coerce the end to a conventional war, their requirements are actually significant. They have to have some way of knowing what is the level of advance of South Korean and US forces, which of their own nuclear forces are still alive, which can they still communicate with. And if they've used one weapon, North Korea that is, in order to try to get South Korea and the US to stop, they have to have the ability to know, did the weapon work? Did it detonate? What was the US and South Korean response? And how do they communicate and negotiate with US and South Korean leaders to get a ceasefire? So the point is, number one is their command and control, including their nuclear command and control, but more broadly, is going to be under intense pressure from the first moments of a conventional war. And number two, the actual requirements they have are much more significant if they're going to use these things coercively than simply having the ability to fire some off in an angry punitive spasm.
And Daryl, if I could jump in there, that's one of the things that has come up in conversation with, say, Feroz in the Pakistan context, right? Where, and this is something that you allude to in the paper, as the assumptions underpinning survivability begin to fray, what does that actually mean at the end of the day for not just for NC3, but response in an actual crisis? It really lends towards very rapid movement towards first use.
This is exactly right. And again, for us who remembered the Cold War, this should be so very familiar to us, because people, I think it was the Desmond Ball quote that came up before, people were pointing out for a good deal of time in the NATO context that our nuclear command requirements in order to coercively escalate in a Cold War scenario and force the Soviets to stop their operations. The NC3 requirements were undoubtedly going to exceed NATO's capabilities. And therefore, they grimly quipped, well, we're going to end up with a massive nuclear exchange in any case because we can't execute our plans. What I'm hoping people will do is realize that those same problems are the problems the North Koreans or the Pakistanis will feel times 10, because their command and control capabilities are so much more limited than what NATO was able to field in the 1980s. And because, especially in the North Korean case, the ferocity of the conventional attacks will be so overwhelming that I fear that North Korea will quickly realize that any hopes they had of small scale gradual escalation, we're going to run into the kinds of realities that Desmond Ball was writing about in the 1980s, and they will be pressed into something much bigger as a retaliatory option.
But Daryl, I have to point out here that what you've done is switch from a discussion of compellence to the failure of deterrence and nuclear warfighting, and pointed out the difficulty that the North Koreans will have in a militarily meaningful nuclear strike against the United States and its allies.
Daryl, in line with what you're talking about, in terms of how states are, and this is along the lines of what we're talking about with DPRK, but also Pakistan, they're increasingly going to need to depend on NC3 in a distributed, stressed situation. But the answer to that remains unclear, particularly in light of all of the things that you've highlighted with precision capabilities, the accuracy of revolution, what have you. In the work that you've done, the thinking that you've put against this, as they begin to rely on those NC3 systems for very complex scenarios, you hark back to the NATO example of where it just fails, everybody dies. Where does this take us, right? So if you think about where the US and the Chinese or perhaps the Russians maybe even could take things because of the resources they have, even then we're creating more vulnerabilities than we know how to deal with. And the introductions of cyber capabilities, the network systems, and all of the rest of the battle space management stuff creates insecurities due to the complexity, but also because of the cyber vulnerabilities that we just haven't even begun to grapple with yet. Where does this all take us? Where does this all end?
It's a great question. The direction of conventional war around the globe is moving toward the arena of long-range precision strike, which relies upon long-range sensing systems of a variety of different types. And the consequence is that even strictly conventional wars are putting command and control and ISR capabilities in the crosshairs. The way the United States would plan to fight a maritime war in the Western Pacific against China, or the way that NATO would plan to defend the Baltics from a Russian attack, it's very hard to imagine either the US or NATO doing so without conducting major attacks on Chinese or Russian command and control, simply because in the era of long range precision strike, NATO aircraft, US ships would just be too vulnerable without such things. But the consequence is that it means it creates a linkage between conventional operations on one hand and nuclear risks on the other, because the nature of our conventional operations blinds their leadership, separates their leadership from their conventional or nuclear forces, and makes it harder and harder for adversary leadership to be confident that our objectives are limited. So we simply are entering a world in which the fundamental role of long-range sensing and long-range communications and the possibilities of long-range strike just put those systems inherently in the crosshairs in military operations.
And one last piece on that front, something that we've talked with others about here, as this new world continues to take shape and evolve, you almost have to hark back to thin line capabilities that allow for, in the context that we're talking about with North Korea, for example, some kind of an ability to say, okay, let's talk. Here's a secure communications capability that we have that's reliable. You can trust it. We need to talk before you are done or before you launch. Your thoughts on that as these are increasingly intertwined NC3 systems, whether it's thinking about the U.S. China dyad or the Korean Peninsula situation, or you start thinking about those countries that are launch states or under extended deterrence. How does that necessity for secure communications capability factor into this? It's something we've talked about with Admiral Gower. It's something we talked about with Feroz and with Avner Cohen in the Israeli context. Just curious as to your thoughts as to where that fits technically, but in as the assumptions underpinning survivability begin to fray, how much more of an increased importance does that sort of a capability become?
I, the problems we've been talking all morning about are fundamental, and they're rooted in the fact that warfare up and down the levels of conflict are unfortunately linked, and that countries who are losing at one level over something they care dearly about have an incentive to threaten warfare at another level in order to get their way. So the problems don't have a solution, but there are things that we could do that would reduce these risks. There are things that we can do in the communications domain, like these sorts of creating better capabilities for leaders to talk with each other during crises and during wars, and we should pursue those. There are also improvements we can make at the war planning level, namely, conventional military operations should not simply be the domain of conventional military planners. The Korean Peninsula, is maybe the most obvious case, but the choices that conventional military planners make about how they wage the conventional war may have major effects on the likelihood of that war going nuclear because of the threats that they choose to pose to adversary leadership. So there's steps we could take in communication that would reduce these risks. There are steps we could take in terms of bringing these escalation control goals into the conventional war planning process. But then the final thing, though it's tough, is recognizing that any major conventional war between nuclear powers is going to be incredibly, incredibly dangerous, and to try to find political solutions to reduce the risk of those conflicts happening in the first place. Now, that's easier said than done, because in reality, there are circumstances that would make the United States use force against some nuclear armed powers, conventional force. There are circumstances that would make the Indian government use force against Pakistan. And so simply saying we need to solve the political problems, it's easier said than done, but ultimately, that's where the major work has to be done to reduce these risks.
Yeah, and it's something that we've talked about internally as well, that there is no technical fix here. It's very much a diplomatic set of initiatives that need to take place.
If we back up briefly for listeners and go back to the NC3 and the new disruptive technologies that are now being superimposed on the legacy NC3 systems in the United States, especially artificial intelligence, can you talk a bit about how you see artificial intelligence affecting this equation of decision making at the speed of light?
Yeah, there are all sorts of, when I talked in this piece and when I've done work on changing technology as it affects NC3 or nuclear arsenal survivability, I've focused on the two families of technologies which are easiest to quantify and demonstrate, namely the accuracy revolution as it affects hardening, and the remote sensing revolution as it affects concealed and mobile forces. While that has been happening, there have been a whole basket of other technological changes. The creation of cyber weapons, the creation of artificial intelligence, both as a multiplier for cyber weapons, as a multiplier for ISR capabilities. There have been a whole range of other technologies which have been happening simultaneously. What I would say is the accuracy revolution and remote sensing revolution that we've modeled and that we've demonstrated as having major effects on force survivability are merely scratching the surface. As you and I both know, Peter, the changes that are happening in both cyber capabilities and AI and machine learning are having potentially even greater consequences pushing in the same direction. It's simply that they're harder to discuss and harder to model at the unclassified level. So for a listener, they should hear what we're saying about the accuracy revolution. They should hear what we're saying about the remote sensing revolution. And they should know that the reality is 5 times worse because of the other changes, which are more difficult to model at the unclassified level.
Well, I guess that's sobering news. So what we really have emerging is a combination of sort of ultra modern technology with really a very primitive form of warfare, which is the use of blasts supplemented by radiation on a enormous scale, aka nuclear weapons. What do you think is going to be the first to be sacrificed in the next 20 or 30 years? What are states going to give up in the cause of stability? Because if they go in the direction that you've been sketching, it seems inevitable that someone is going to lose control, go first to limit their own damage, and then the world will stop.
Well, I guess I see it slightly differently, which is I see these new electronic cyber weapons as principally aiding the strong, as principally aiding the same side, us, who has the ability to use precise conventional weapons to try to get our way. I see the nuclear weapons, the big, bad, ugly blast radiation weapons, as principally being the instrument of the weak to try to thwart us. And so, in the same way as in the Cold War, we didn't have the capacity to compete at the conventional level or didn't believe we did. And we reached for these big, nasty, destructive means to counter. That's where I see the big old legacy technology playing. It's as the instrument of stalemate for the weak as they try to fend off conventional and cyber and other sorts of operations by the strong.
But Daryl, in the next 20 years, even a North Korea is going to come up with a hybrid of ultra modern and primitive military technologies, aren't they? I mean, the rate of diffusion and the scalability or the modularity, the fact that many of these new technologies can be researched and developed and deployed at very small scales. In fact, that may be where the innovation erupts, is not in the big labs, the giant labs of the great powers, but actually in small powers because they have the most brilliant scientists, and the technology itself is amenable to that kind of approach. I mean, after all, it's China that is well in front at this point, probably in the quantum communications race, which will affect NC3 in spades. So isn't it possible in the next generation that not that the tables will be turned, but that big versus small no longer has such a meaning when it comes to how these technologies would be deployed in a face-off?
It's a great question you're asking, and it's what you're putting your finger on a very broad and very important debate about the effects of technology on the balance between the strong and the weak around the world. And there are those who have believed that a range of modern technologies associated, all stemming from the computer revolution, have the effect of being democratizing. And they strengthen protesters against dictatorships. They strengthen weak countries against strong countries, et cetera. And there's something to be said for that. We certainly see that a relatively weak country can use relatively modern technology like drones and do a lot of damage to the global energy system, at least temporarily.
It's interesting to look at the actual numbers. I mean, recently I went looking to find out how many states and how many people live in states that actually have nuclear weapons or are under nuclear umbrellas or host nuclear weapons infrastructure. Turns out it's actually not an easy number to find. And so I actually calculated it from scratch in a spreadsheet, and I found that there were 39 nuclear weapon states or nuclear umbrella states or states that host nuclear weapons infrastructure, countries like Japan, Korea, and so on. And that's about 20% of the 193 states on the planet, but they actually constitute 57% of the world's population. So currently, a majority of the world actually live in states that, quote unquote, enjoy the protection of nuclear weapons. The other 47%, and the vast majority of states, of course, don't. And so this bifurcation, is a fundamental one, as we saw in the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty and the standoff over that treaty. So it strikes me that things are going to change pretty radically, and we can't foresee that. And in the midst of that, we have this NC3 problem where states are increasingly vulnerable. And my guess is, as that technology is diffused, they will find ways of actually making American NC3 vulnerable in ways that it's not at the moment. So it really is incumbent upon us to find ways to enhance stability in the midst of this tumultuous change. So I want to, as our last question, just go back to this issue of a thin line. You'll remember at the conference that you presented at that Eric Gross presented a somewhat heretical argument, which is NC3 systems, whether they're American or non-American, but especially those that are complex and multi-layered and a combination of legacy and brand new ultra-modern systems, likely to, I think the phrase he uses is, they're likely to fail robustly under stress. I actually had to look that term up. It turns out there's a meaning in the computer world or in the cyber world of fail robustly. It means it basically, the system collapses. It can't meet its operating goal. And so he put forward the argument that actually private actors need to create a highly secure, highly reliable, thin line for emergency use and fallback for nuclear weapons commanders around the world. And they should do this with an open source technology. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether that's a useful thing to do, or if states are basically going to be disinterested in that approach and are immune to its possible effects.
I don't have a thought about that, but what I would say is, in my view, the impediment to thinking systematically about what the capabilities of a thin line system would need to have and what safeguards would need to be built in, the impediment to thinking systematically about that is a resistance in our community to seeing the logic that might lead adversaries to intentionally and rationally employ nuclear weapons during a conventional war. That was a logic that we understood well in 1975 and 1985 when it was us trying to avert our own conventional defeat. But now when we think about North Korea or Pakistan or Russia employing these weapons, we very quickly start to dismiss that logic and say it would require madness on their side to actually go down that path. Before we can start thinking about what NC3 requirements an adversary might have to avert these crisis instability dynamics, we have to have a serious investigation of the logics that would lead them to brandish or employ nuclear weapons in a conventional war. And only after we've done that can we then think systematically about the minimal NC3 capabilities that they would need in the system and whether that could be enhanced or ensured in some sort of a cooperative fashion.
One of the difficulties I have in talking to my American colleagues as an outsider, because born in Australia, you're always an outsider. many shared cultural values, but also distinct perspectives. Not the least is when you're standing in Australia and look up, you see different stars. But, the reality is with nuclear weapons and NC3 systems, you're actually putting your fate in your enemy's hands. You actually, in some sense, are declaring that they're competent enough to manage their systems and their conflict relationship with you to not slip up, to not screw up, to not be insane. But if you recognize that, so many things follow. And so we tend to not want to recognize that.
Peter, I think that's exactly right. But there's one other conundrum that's layered on top, which is, at least in the United States, there is a community in the US government and even in the US military who's interested in ensuring adversary minimal NC3 to avert the kind of disasters that you were just implying. But there's also a community, meaning the conventional war planners, who are the dominant community, and their job is planning to take down adversary command and control, not because they're necessarily interested in adversary nuclear capabilities, but because in the real world, the leadership is the leadership, and their communication systems at the conventional and nuclear level often overlap. So we have these two different communities who are thinking about these problems simultaneously, but with opposite objectives. One community recognizes that their safety and survival is in the hands of a stable, robust adversary NC3, and the other is recognizing the other reality, which is also true, which is, should there be a conventional war, our success in that war, our minimization of US or friendly casualties, depends upon us rapidly undermining enemy command and control. And those communities rarely talk to each other, and those contradictions rarely rise to the level of senior political decision makers. And that's the twin dilemma we face.
Daryl, really appreciate you having taken the time to do this with us. It's great. It's a fascinating conversation. There's so many elements to this that I think we could expand upon and talk about much more extensively. But thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. And we urge readers to read your paper. It's a terrific, somewhat mind-blowing piece, and everyone needs to be acquainted with these arguments.
Thanks again, Daryl. As always, thanks to our listeners. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. Be sure to check it out. Until then, subscribe to the pod via SoundCloud, check us out on Twitter, or get in touch via the website. Look forward to hearing from everybody.